Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to examine something truly fascinating. We're looking at the intricate structural design and the hidden textual architecture embedded right into the biblical narrative. So often we read these historical texts as just a series of disconnected stories. But when you actually take a step back and look at the blueprints, a massive, cohesive architectural masterpiece reveals itself.
Okay, let's dive right into this ancient master plan. Our story really gains its structural footing with Abraham. He's essentially the foundational pillar of this sweeping historical blueprint. We're going to trace how a simple promise, made to a nomadic guy in the ancient Near East, somehow becomes the absolute bedrock for a structure that spans millennia, ultimately pointing straight forward to Jesus. So, here is our structural plan for the Explainer today. We'll be hitting 6 key points. 1. Expanding the covenant blessing. 2. Promises upgraded to oaths. 3. The tests of faith. 4. Mirrors and typology. 5. The bridge to Egypt. And finally, number 6, the ultimate salvation blueprint.
All right, section 1, expanding the covenant blessing. We absolutely have to start by looking at how the foundational footings of this architecture were laid down early in the text. I mean, you can't build a massive cathedral without first coring a solid expanding base, right? It is so interesting to see how the covenant systematically expands, literally building layer upon layer through history. It takes the shape of a stepped foundation where life reveals blessing, and then that blessing gets passed on through families. This isn't just random, chaotic history. It's highly organized, very intentional growth. The crucial thing here is observing how this structure scales up. We kick things off in phase 1 with Adam, where the covenant is simply a marriage, just a husband and wife. Then, in phase 2 with Noah, the architecture expands to protect a whole household. By phase 3, it blows up into a widespread tribe under Abraham as chief. Why does this matter? Well, it shows us a God who doesn't just scrap the project and start over when things go wrong. He builds outward, increasing the capacity of this covenant structure at every single stage. Moving into section 2, promises upgraded to oaths. With that expanding foundation poured, the narrative shifts to the specific legal contracts that are going to govern this massive building project. The initial blueprints are drafted as 3 distinct promises given to Abraham in Genesis 12. Now put yourself in his shoes for a second. Abraham is 75 years old, he's incredibly wealthy, but he's got literally 0 kids. Not exactly your typical candidate to start a massive royal dynasty, is he? Yet he responds with absolute faith to a nomadic life based entirely on 3 specific divine promises. First, land and nationhood. Second, kingship and a royal dynasty, which is what is meant by a great name. And third, a worldwide family that will bring universal blessing. Now watch how this builds, because those initial verbal promises get a major upgrade. They are legally transformed into binding, formal covenant oaths. In Genesis 15, that promise of land and nationhood becomes a sworn oath, graphically sealed by God with a sacrifice. Then we flip over to Genesis 17, and the promise of kingship is upgraded to an oath, this time sealed by Abraham's obedience through the sign of circumcision, which, let's be real, takes tremendous faith. The architect is locking these blueprints into a binding legal reality. That brings us to section 3, the tests of faith. Because, of course, every grand architectural structure has to undergo intense stress testing to prove its integrity. And Abraham's journey is absolutely no different. You can really see the dramatic peaks and valleys of his lived experience. It's a massive roller coaster. You have these high, soaring, divine promises, completely contrasted with the incredibly gritty reality of his trials. He's literally promised the world, but his day-to-day life is just fraught with danger and doubt. If we follow the timeline of his life, we see this structure endure famine and exile almost immediately after the promise is given. Then come regional wars, intense family strife, marital discord, and this agonizing wait for an unfulfilled promise of an heir. All of this tension is purposefully building up. It's leading directly to the ultimate stress test on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22. Where he's suddenly asked to sacrifice the very son through whom all these promises were supposed to flow. All right, section 4, mirrors and typology. Having examined the blueprints and the stress tests, we can now step back and look for the repeating design patterns, what literary and biblical studies call typology. Typology is honestly like finding a perfectly mirrored reflection of a building's final design hidden away in its earliest sketches. The text introduces these fascinating figures like Melchizedek, who act as typological mirrors. They beautifully reflect the final architectural design long before the structure is even completed. And this just brilliantly illustrates the deliberate parallels embedded in the text.
Think about Melchizedek. He's the ancient priest king of Salem, which, by the way, means peace. He just steps onto the pages of Genesis completely out of nowhere, offering bread and wine and blessing Abraham. Fast forward, and you have Christ, the eternal priest king offering the bread and wine of the Eucharist and blessing humanity. The text of Hebrews explicitly links these two across time. It is a stunning bit of architectural symmetry. But actually, the most profound typological mirror occurs during the binding of Isaac, which is known as the Akedah. This is the narrative's absolute climax of obedience. It is a sharp, intentional contrast to the disobedience we saw all the way back in the Garden of Eden.
When you compare these two narratives side by side, the structural genius of this text becomes completely undeniable. Isaac is the only beloved son of his father. Jesus is the only beloved son of the Father. Isaac literally carries the wood for his own sacrifice up the hill. Jesus carries the wood of the cross. Jewish tradition even notes that Isaac was bound at his own request, making it a willing self-offering, exactly as Jesus willingly offers himself. And in both cases, the father symbolically or literally receives the son back on the third day. Even the geography of these events is woven together. Mount Moriah, where Isaac was bound and where the temple was eventually built, shares the exact same mountain range as Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. It's here that Abraham's prophetic words, "God will provide himself the lamb," echo through the centuries. The rings of the promised seed from Genesis 3 and Genesis 22 intersect perfectly across generations, converging on one singular figure. Which brings us to Section 5, the bridge to Egypt. To transition from this era of individual patriarchs into the building of a massive, unified nation, the architect had to construct a very specific, carefully engineered narrative bridge down into Egypt. But notice how the materials for this bridge are selected. The text consistently, almost playfully, subverts our human expectations. The younger ends up serving the older. Ishmael is passed over for Isaac. Esau is passed over for Jacob. The older brothers are passed over for Joseph. Why do this? To prove that the structure relies entirely on divine power and mercy, rather than our human conventions. It's a powerful reminder that the architect's plans rarely follow human logic. Joseph's harrowing life steps trace this exact bridge to Egypt. The guy's betrayed by his own jealous brothers into slavery, yet he's elevated by God to become prime minister. This wild turn of events allows a reunion that saves his family from famine, but ultimately sets the stage for the enslavement of the sons of Israel by a new pharaoh. And this flawlessly fulfills that eerie, specific prophecy God gave to Abraham way back in Genesis 15, that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land but eventually delivered. And finally, Section 6, the ultimate salvation blueprint. This is where we get to step back, take the scaffolding down, and look at the completed masterpiece that the original text was pointing toward all along. Here it is in all its glory. Those 3 original promises given to a childless nomad in Genesis 12 seamlessly lock into the major covenants of salvation history. The promise of land and nationhood from Genesis 15 becomes the Mosaic covenant, establishing the nation. The promise of kingship and a great name from Genesis 17 becomes the Davidic covenant, establishing the kingdom. And that massive promise of worldwide blessing from Genesis 22 becomes the new covenant, establishing universal salvation in Christ. The architectural plan is totally finalized, unified, and perfectly resolved. So as we wrap up today's explainer, I really want you to consider the immense interconnected design of this ancient blueprint. We've traced the structural beams all the way from Genesis to Jesus, and we've witnessed how every single test, every mirrored typology, and every oath locked perfectly into place. It leaves you wondering, if dozens of different writers over thousands of years were able to construct a narrative with such breathtaking architectural unity, what other incredible patterns are just waiting to be discovered in these pages? Thank you so much for exploring the architecture of faith with me today. Keep looking closely at the blueprints. I promise you, the design is always deeper than it appears.